Is it better to be feared or respected? And I say, is it too much to ask for both? They say the best weapon is one you never have to fire. I respectfully disagree. I prefer the weapon you only have to fire once. Find an excuse to let one of these off the chain, and I personally guarantee you the bad guys won't even want to come out of their caves. For your consideration, the Jericho.
Stellaris has a lot of weapons. I have done a lot of testing with those weapons, and now I'm going to break down everything I know by putting it in a tier list and telling you all about it. With absolutely no further ado, let's dive straight in to this Stellaris weapons tier list. The F tier is reserved for the worst of the worst, the absolute dog poo of weapons in the game. And you don't get much worse than these two. First off, we have the Energy Siphon. Now this will deal plus 100% damage to shields and minus 75% damage to armor. It also is only available in small slot, has a reasonable range of 60, that's kind of the only plus here, and has relatively low damage for its class and size. Currently, with the rebalance to armor and shields, that being armor hit points per module being quite a bit higher than shield modules, even if ships are split pretty evenly between armor and shields, they will have quite a lot more armor than they do shields. Not only that, there is a maximum amount of shields any ship can have because you need to power those shields, and so when you inevitably come up against the armor on a ship, these weapons will do basically no damage. They are slightly better if you take the Cordyceptic Civic as a hive mind because you get a 50% damage buff, but they're still pretty garbage. That would kind of put them one tier higher in the C tier. And then the Null Void Beam, honestly, is even worse. This does 400% damage against shields. It does come in three sizes, small, medium, and large, each dealing slightly more damage than the size above, but still, they are doing slightly more damage than a tier 1 weapon, but less than a tier 2. They also deal 75% less damage against armor and hull. That hull reduction is probably the worst of the bunch here, meaning when it finally comes time to kill a ship, Null Void Beams will be so ineffectual. It's like trying to kill a person with a foam hammer. Definitely not recommended. Now we move over to the other side of the tier list. This is where I'm putting all of the Archaeo weapons. Why are they in their own category? Well, Archaeo weapons currently cost minor artifacts, and each Archaeo weapon, pretty much no matter its size, costs roughly 10 minor artifacts per slot. That means if you fill up, let's say, a cruiser with 6 of these weapons, you're looking at 60 or 70 minor artifacts per cruiser. This means that it is very, very, very difficult to actually fully equip a fleet of, say, 1,000 naval capacity with Archaeo weapons. You'll have to do it over a long period of time, and if those fleets get lost, well, you can simply kiss your chances of rebuilding the ships yet again. So whilst these weapons may be quite powerful in their own right, they are deeply hampered by the economics of the situation. I should also mention that all of the weapons you see here will be buffed by 33% damage output if you take the Archaeo Engineer's Ascension perk, and if you're going to use Archaeo weapons, you should definitely do that. So do bear in mind that we're looking at these through the lens of an extra 33% damage on top of whatever you see here. The macro batteries are conceptually interesting, but their actual usefulness is very, very low. First off, they of course cost these minor artifacts, and they are equivalent to a low tier 3 mass driver weapon, a railgun. They're actually slightly worse than that. What do they bring to the table? Well, they have a terrible accuracy at only 50%, which is honestly diabolical. If you're coming up against something which has very high evasion, you'll simply not hit it. You only need 50% evasion after any tracking negations, and macro batteries will never ever hit their target, which is diabolical. They do deal 50% extra damage to shield and get a 50% damage reduction to armor. As I've covered before, any armor damage reductions is actually much worse than a shield damage reduction because of the way that hit points are now given by the shield and armor modules. They do deal normal damage to hull, which is alright, and their special ability, if you could call it that, is that they have no minimum range on the large weapon. Most weapons in Stellaris now have a minimum range if they're in the large size, meaning you cannot shoot at something if it is too close to your ship. These are, to all intents and purposes, simply much worse than their regular mass driver equivalents, and you should never put these on your ships when you have a mass driver available. A normal railgun, for example, that you can research through the engineering tech tree. In the C tier, we find weapons that can be useful. They're definitely better than the garbage we've just looked at. However, there are clearly better examples right now because of the way that combat is currently balanced. Mining lasers are a fun weapon you can unlock if you research debris from some of the mining drones you might find out there in the galaxy. However, they are basically worse than their tier 3 energy weapon equivalents. They will do 50% less damage to shield, 50% more damage to armor, and 50% more damage to hull. They come in small and medium size and have relatively short ranges, and as I just mentioned, their damage output does leave something to be desired. If you can rush these weapons very, very early on and get them so early enough that they are much worse than their plasma equivalents or laser equivalents, then in that case, it could be worth using them. Otherwise, you'll probably go through most of your games without ever needing to put them on your ships. Cloud lightning can be salvaged from void clouds. There is one niche use for this weapon, that's if you put it on your battleships in their L slots along with an arc emitter, because these are bypass weapons. They will penetrate 100% of shield and armor and hit straight at the hull. So if you don't want to equip weapons like lasers or kinetics to be needlessly hitting these shields and armor when your main X slot is hitting the hull, this could be a useful weapon in that case. I'll get into why that's probably not the best idea later when we get to arc emitters, but Cloud Lightning is basically a bit worse than a tier 1 disruptor. So it's a large weapon. One large weapon is the equivalent of 2 medium weapons, and this doesn't even do double the damage of a medium disruptor. Its range is slightly better at 60, however it's really just not that good. Now we come to the humble mass drivers. This weapon chain is available right from the start of the game, and you can research all the way up to the tier 5 Gauss cannon. Unfortunately, there is a massive prevalence for armor. Ships and star bases will tend to have quite a lot more armor points than shield points simply because of the way that armor modules give their HP now than in previous patches of Stellaris. This means that whilst they deal 50% extra damage to shield, that minus 50% damage to armor is equivalent to something like minus 75% damage if it was against shields, possibly even higher if you're looking at how much damage you'd need to do to eat through a single defensive module. They also have a minimum range if you put them in an L slot function, meaning any ships flying in at under 45, you simply cannot hit them. If you put these things on a defense platform on an L slot and you get swarmed with corvettes, you can kiss goodbye to your starbase. For a small while, autocannons were the go-to weapon to put on some corvettes if you wanted to artificially buff your diplomatic weight. However, that has now been fixed, or will be fixed very soon if the patch notes are to be believed, and so we'll only be considering autocannons from a military perspective. They deal 50% extra damage to shield, a whopping minus 75% damage against armor, and a nice 25% damage against hull. They do come in small, medium, and large, but all three have very low range. 30 for small weapons, up to 40 for your large weapons. Yes, they have a high average damage, however, as soon as you come up against armor, and as I've said again and again, ships and star bases have so many more hit points of armor now than they used to, it'll be like a small child running straight into a brick wall. They're not going to get through it. And if you're enjoying this video, please run headfirst into that like button. The Giga Cannon is essentially the most powerful kinetic weapon you can find in Stellaris. This fits into an X slot only, and that is one of the largest downsides here. X slot weapons can only be placed on battleships, and they have a small 25-degree firing arc. This means that if your battleships are trying to move away from the enemy, if they have artillery or carrier combat computers, they won't be able to actually fire this weapon. That's a massive nuisance in the current version of the game, so you'll actually find it quite difficult to get off shots with a Giga Cannon now. They do deal 50% damage against shields and minus 25% damage against armor, but they do no increased damage versus hull. This means that unless you're fighting against the unbidden, and even then I might argue there could be better uses for your X-slot weapons or simply better fleet designs than using a Giga Cannon, you are not going to want to put this on your ship. Point defense has never been great in Stellaris. These weapons will allow you to shoot down incoming missiles, and also they should shoot down some incoming strike craft. If your enemy is running exclusively missiles and torpedoes, then these weapons are actually relatively useful. I would argue there's a slightly better PD slot weapon we could put in there though, and we'll get to that one in a moment. So these deal minus 75% damage against shield, 200% damage against armor, and bypass 25% of the armor hitting straight into the hull. You do not want to use these though unless you are certain your enemy will be coming with missiles and torpedoes and you want to prevent your ships being blown out of the sky. That is where you want to make sure that you have good intel on your enemy empire and you fit your ships accordingly. Last up from our C tier regular weapons, we have the Perdition Beam. This weapon can only be fitted on the T slot of a Titan. It has a massive range of 250, allowing you to strike across an entire star system most of the time. Its accuracy is pretty good at 85%, but it has absolutely no tracking. This weapon deals 25% less damage to shield, 50% more damage against armor, and an extra 25% damage against hull. The average damage per hit from this weapon is between 5,000 and 10,000, meaning if you are shooting at normal ships, anything you hit will be killed. However, that is part of the downside here. You will be overkilling any corvettes, any destroyers, probably also any cruisers that you come up against with this weapon, and it has a whopping 25.5-day cooldown, so you can only fire it very rarely. It is best used if you're trying to crack open a well-defended starbase or something like that, but its weakness in terms of cooldown time is very, very large and cannot be ignored. Moving over to our Archeo weapons, we have the Ancient Saturator Artillery. This deals a whopping plus 150% damage to shield, but has a massive minus 75% damage against armor, and then rounds it out with a nice plus 25% damage against hull. This weapon is only useful really if you're coming up against the unbidden or any ships without armor. Just like autocannons, it is going to really struggle to chew through any armored opponents. We're about to break through the halfway point by going through the B tier. Now, the weapons in this tier probably shouldn't still make up the mainstay of your forces. However, there are some specific uses, some specific situations where they are going to really, really excel. Let's dive in and have a look. Plasma weapons are absolutely amazing at dealing with any opponents that have absolutely no shields. They are great if you're fighting space fauna like a space dragon or something else like the Praetorian, and they have no shields, just a lot of armor and hit points to chew through. The reason for that is that plasma weapons take a whopping minus 75% damage against shields. They do have plus 100% damage against armor and plus 50% damage against hull, which is nice. But whilst those damage increases are good, having minus 75% damage against shields will be very painful if you come up against even an adequately shielded opponent. And that's why I would most of the time recommend taking a slightly different weapon than plasma. Though they are still good and probably the best weapon we've seen so far. Neutron launchers are one of two weapon types you can fit in G torpedo slots. But oh, how the mighty have fallen. Like all torpedoes, they will deal additional multiplicative damage based on the target's ship size. So they will deal 2 times damage against corvettes and frigates, 3 times damage against destroyers, 5 times damage against cruisers, and a whopping 9 times damage against battleships. They have a very, very long cooldown, almost as long as the Titan beam at 21.25 days. Their accuracy also leaves something to be desired at 75%. They deal minus 50% damage against shields, an additional 50% damage against armor, and a whopping plus 75% damage against hull. Their initial damage output has also been massively nerfed since previous patches. Generally, I'd almost never recommend you actually use neutron launchers outside of a few edge cases. Now, they are great to put on defensive platforms in a pulsar system or in a system where you set up a Zroni Stormcaster. As long as you can send these weapons into the fight against someone that does not have any shields, they're actually going to be pretty powerful. But because they're limited by G slots, you can only place them on your cruisers, your frigates, and your defense platforms. So overall, you can't really bring that many of them to the fight. They also take up more slot equivalent spaces than they used to when they were just L slot weapons. They have a firing arc of 25 degrees, so you cannot kite effectively with them if you do put them in some cruisers. And on top of all of that, they have a minimum range, so if anyone gets in close, they also can't shoot either. And generally, they're just not as good as they used to be, which is why they're here in the B tier. Matter disintegrators, which you can get your hands on by researching debris from the Unbidden or other extra-dimensional invaders, are very similar to neutron launchers. They don't go in G slots, they come in small, medium, and large, and they also have quite a bit shorter range at 30 at the small and 70 at the large size, but in terms of their damage output, it's quite similar. They do minus 75% damage against shield, plus 50% damage against armor, and plus 50% damage against hull. On top of that, they deal an additional 10% damage based on the target ship size. That is 1.1 times damage to a corvette, and all the way up to 1.8 times damage against a battleship. The main issues with this weapon are, first off, that reduction to shield can be very, very unpleasant, just like the plasma. They also have relatively short range, and you can't get them until quite late on. However, unlike neutron launchers, you can put this weapon on basically any ship class because it isn't a torpedo. Arc emitters are the bypass X-slot weapon. They will penetrate 100% of shield and armor, hitting directly against the hull. They also have 100% accuracy like your regular disruptors, meaning they will hit every time. This does not, however, mean they cannot be evaded by ships with high evasion. They do have a pesky 25-degree firing arc, meaning your battleships will not be able to kite and still fire these weapons. If they're not facing the right way, they simply won't be able to shoot. On top of that, yes, they can be very good, especially against fallen empires, if you're trying to strip the enemy of their hull points and they have quite a few armor and shield hit points relative to those hull points. But if you come up against any armor or shield hardening, you are going to have a very bad time. You will find it very difficult to punch through that. Their minimum damage is also set at 1 or 2, depending on which tier of the weapon you have, and that means if you have only a few of these on your ships, RNG may not be on your side and you can deal minimal damage. It's an edge case, but it can happen and it can be very, very annoying. Due to their bypass nature penetrating armor and shields completely, you will want to combine these weapons with other bypass type weapons. Unfortunately, other than Cloud Lightning, which only has a low range of 60, you don't have any long-range bypass weapons that will work well on something like a battleship to combine with these arc emitters. It can be a reasonable idea to run these alone, so only put these on your battleships and no other weapons. You will reduce cost that way. However, that's not the optimum ship layout I would recommend. Amoeba flagella are a type of strike craft you can get by researching debris from space amoeba or doing a special project. They have very good average damage output, actually outputting about the same average damage as a tier 3 advanced strike craft, and you can get these much earlier in the game. However, they do have lower accuracy and tracking. This makes them less effective at killing high evasion ships like corvettes. They completely penetrate shields, do an additional 50% damage against armor, and regular damage against hull. The actual flagella themselves also have no shielding, unlike normal strike craft, which means they are relatively susceptible to normal PD in addition to flak. Flak, like point defense, fit in your PD slots. This class, however, is intended to take down strike craft. They get a whopping plus 100% damage against shields, they ignore 25% of all shields, they do have minus 75% damage against armor, and deal regular damage to hull. On top of that, if you upgrade them to their final form, the Nanite Flak Battery, they still don't cost any nanites. I'm not sure if that's an oversight. If it's not, it means that the highest level of your flak artillery here are much more powerful than the highest equivalent level of PD, which is only really level 3. Now the reason they are up here in the B tier is that by using them early on in conjunction with lasers on your corvettes, you end up with the best all-round corvette design from the start of the game. Corvettes equipped with 1 flak battery and 2 lasers can handle pretty much any threat the game decides to throw at you. They can deal with strike-craft platforms, they can deal with incoming missiles, they have lasers, which we'll get to soon, but lasers are very good weapons now, and all round they make for a pretty good ship design. Later on in the game, you might need to take some flak artillery on your corvette still if you're coming up against strike-craft repeatedly and you don't like dying. Moving over to the archeo weapon side of the B tier, we have the Ancient Cavitation Collapser. This is basically like a laser, but with a few minor tweaks. You will deal minus 50% damage against shield, plus 50% damage against armor, and then you will also ignore 50% of the armor, so it has somewhat of a bypass type capacity. It also has the damage output, if you include Archeo Engineers, of slightly better than a tier 4 laser. Now I'm going to hold my hands up here and say these weapons are really good. However, if you're going to shell out on minor artifacts, unless you possibly have menacing ships that don't cost any of them, if you are going to shell out on minor artifacts, there are more effective weapons that deal bypass damage amongst the Archeo weapons. The Ancient Ruination Glare is the Archeo Titan Beam weapon, and in a lot of ways it is a straight up improvement on the Perdition Beam. Yes, it does deal less damage to shields, it has minus 50% damage to shields, but it does more damage to armor at plus 75% and the same damage to hull at plus 25%. It has half of the range at only 125, meaning you will be shooting this weapon and getting into engagement range much later, and it also has a low firing arc of 10 degrees. But it only has a cooldown of 14.5 days, which is almost half the cooldown of the Perdition Beam. Just like the Perdition Beam, it deals 5,000 to 10,000 base damage output, so it is again a one-shot, one-kill weapon. It will not have the same Alpha Strike potential as the Perdition Beam because it does shoot a bit later, but it will hit more often, meaning you're killing more ships. And as combats tend to last longer in the current version of Stellaris, this is a good thing. However, just because it is a better weapon doesn't mean you want to put it on your Titan class ships. Titans also come with auras, and putting a Perdition Beam with something like a carrier computer will keep your Titans much further back and much further away from the combat, and thus much safer. So you do have to think about exactly what kind of role your Titan will fulfill. Whether you want it for damage output, which is unlikely, or you want it for those auras. Ancient Defensive Web Slingers are basically a tier 4 version of point defense. That's basically the only reason they're up here rather than one tier lower. They have similar damage output stats to the Nanite Flak Battery. They're great at shooting down missiles, and they're pretty good as weapons on their own if you want to put something in the S slot. We've seen a lot of weapons so far. In the A tier, we are now arriving at a class of weapons that I expect to see on a lot of your ships. These are going to be the weapons you will want for the mainstay in your fleets. There are still better weapons in the S tier, but depending on the specific circumstances, we're basically getting to the best available weapon for doing a specific job, without being too over-specified. If you come up against something you are not expecting, you should still have a reasonably good time. First up, we have lasers. Now, lasers are generally the best starting game weapons that you can get. They do deal minus 50% damage against shields, which is annoying, but they have plus 50% damage against armor and a very tasty additional 25% damage against hull. They have 90% accuracy across the board, and on top of that, the L-slot lasers do not have a minimum range. They will be able to hit any ship no matter how close it is. Now let's talk about that reduction to shield damage. Shields generally have less hit points than their equivalent armor slots, and shields require power, meaning you cannot fully equip a ship with shields. This means that in general, lasers will have a much easier time with their minus 50% damage reduction against shields than equivalent kinetic weapons have with their minus 50% damage against armor. This basically means lasers are now better than kinetics. On top of that, they get that 25% damage against hull. It's just bonkers. Everything I've just said about shields and armor also applies to the Tachyon Lance, which is now hands down the best X-slot weapon you can choose. It has minus 50% damage against shields, a whopping plus 100% damage against armor, and a very tasty plus 50% damage against hull. It has pretty equivalent average damage to the Giga Cannon, but a much lower cooldown of only 9.95 days. Like all X-slot weapons, it does suffer from the issue of having a firing arc of only 25 degrees. Again, this makes kiting very, very difficult with this weapon type. And it can only be placed, of course, on a battleship with an X-slot. And battleships now are slow, cumbersome beasts that are not as good as they once were. Torpedoes have really nullified their advantages. But that aside, the Tachyon Lance is still an excellent weapon, and if you want to make use of X-slots, you should use one of these. Also, one final thing to note, just like lasers, they do not have a minimum range, meaning you can put these on battleships and charge them straight into the front lines of the enemy, and they'll still keep shooting. Kinetic artillery is the best kinetic weapon you'll find in the game. They fit on large slots, meaning you can put them on cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. They have a relatively low cooldown of only 7.15 days and quite nice damage output, with an average damage of 40.9. They deal plus 100% damage against shield, but they do suffer from minus 50% damage against armor. They can be used very effectively on battleships if you're trying to build some artillery battleships. And unlike the X-slot weapons or the torpedoes, they have no firing arc, so they can be used for kiting, which is really, really nice. If you know your opponent is mainly shield based with little to no armor, you'll definitely want to use kinetic launchers on your L-slots. And even if they do have armor, kinetic launchers and kinetic artillery deal quite fearsome damage output, and that minus 50% reduction isn't as bad as it could be. You will still find they are relatively effective. The best use for them is if you're doing some sort of defense in-depth tactic where you are trying to harass incoming enemy forces, knocking them out, destroying them, whilst knowing your own ships are going to be disengaging and retreating to fight in the next system and the next system and the system after that, because they have very impressive range at 120. After the combat rework, missiles are more powerful than they have ever been. They are now your go-to artillery type weaponry to be shooting at an enemy from a distance, and if you're trying to kite them. Coupling missiles with something like an artillery or carrier combat computer and very fast ships can even mean your enemy is simply never able to actually shoot you, whilst your ships keep staying far enough away to be out of range and harass them with wave after wave of missiles. They're also very effective when used in combination with torpedoes if your enemy is running point defense. Point defense might be shooting your torpedoes out of the sky, so saturating the sky with missiles is a good way of limiting the effectiveness of your enemy's defenses. Missiles have 100% accuracy, they fully bypass shields, and then do regular damage to armor and hull. As you level them up, you'll get more and more damage output from these missiles, and don't forget these are only small slot weapons, you can't put them on anything larger than that. Scourge missiles can be salvaged from the Praetorian Scourge if you manage to kill some of them. They have, just like regular missiles, 100% penetration against shields, however they do slightly less damage to armor at minus 20%. They also have somewhat of a torpedo-like effect. They deal an additional 50% damage depending on the target ship's size. So they do 1.5 damage against corvettes and frigates, 2 damage against destroyers, 3 damage against cruisers, and 5 times damage against battleships. They do also take up G slots, so they are torpedo-class weapons, and generally you're going to want to put torpedoes in rather than these because the torpedoes are pretty much better, but they are still good weapons in and of themselves. The power level of Strikecraft has gone up and down with different patches of Stellaris. From my testing, I found that Strikecraft are quite powerful in the current version. They are especially powerful at dealing with ships with high evasion because at the top level you'll be getting 100% accuracy and 100% tracking, meaning they will always hit and evasion is completely irrelevant. Like missiles, Strikecraft completely bypass shields, however they also get an additional 50% damage against armor. If you can put these on your cruisers and get your cruisers to have high enough speed to be able to completely stay away from the enemy, they can be very devastating, especially when combined with missile salvos. However, against other large ship classes like cruisers and battleships, Strikecraft do tend to fall off quite a bit. Swarm strikers can be researched by looking at Praetorian debris. These are a little bit different to your regular Strikecraft, however, and that's because they're closer to full bypass Strikecraft. They have 100% penetration against shield and 66% penetration against armor. This means they're going to be hitting the hull characteristics of a ship earlier, which I think generally makes them better than regular Strikecraft, but it won't be until quite late in the game that you actually get your hands on these things. Also, by having armor instead of shields on these craft, they are much less vulnerable to flak and other Strikecraft, but are very, very vulnerable to point defense. Luckily for you though, if you send some missiles in along with these Strikecraft, the point defense will more likely target the missiles than these swarm strikers, and thus they should remain relatively unscathed. We're now pretty much at the end of the tier list. In the S tier, you'll find the weapons that I believe you should be picking first and foremost when you start looking through your box of goodies and are deciding what to equip your ships with. Disruptors have a true underdog story. For years, they were completely useless, dealing very low damage, not being very useful. Basically, yeah, they were crap. They were really crap, ladies and gentlemen. But now, oh my goodness me now disruptors are possibly the best weapons in the game. They can only fit on small and medium slots, they have 100% accuracy, and depending if they're small or medium, 60% tracking or 35% tracking. Combining that with combat computers should allow you to negate any evasion bonuses your enemy has, meaning you'll always be hitting. Their average damage is lower than other weapons of a relative class. However, they more than make up for that with 100% penetration against shield and armor. These weapons are going to fly in and completely shred any ships, any stations, any fallen empires, anything that you come up against. The only exception probably being a 25 times crisis. You don't really want close range weapons like a disruptor to deal with those kind of ships because you will die to their weapons. 25 times crisis weapons tend to kill with a single shot, and thus you don't want to be in close range. If you can help it, you don't want them to even ever shoot at you. But what happens if your opponent starts getting some armor or shield hardening? Well, that will help them. However, it will not prevent you from still winning. Coming up against fleets with armor and shield hardening, armor being the best way to counter disruptors actually, is going to mean the balance of power is closer to even Stevens rather than you simply curb stomping your opponent with the disruptors. If you want to face off against disruptors, the next two weapons might be your best bet. The main disadvantage of using regular missiles is that they can be shot down by enemy point defense. Whirlwind missiles completely sidestep that issue by providing target saturation to your opponent's point defense systems. Through sheer weight of numbers, they will get through. Not only that, they now deal more damage than regular missiles. They are M slot only, so you can only really run these on your cruisers, on your battleships, and on your destroyers, but they're still really, really good. With a range of 120, they're also some of the longest range weapons in the game. As I've said already, they have quite high damage. They have 100% shield penetration, meaning they will always ignore shields, unless your opponent has some shield hardening, and then deal 100% damage to armor and hull. It can be really, really good to combine these with our next weapon, which is torpedoes. These weapons are the best in the game when it comes to taking down large ships. They do have a very long cooldown of 20 days, but they have 100% accuracy, they completely penetrate all shields, and deal an additional 50% damage against armor. On top of that, they deal more damage based on the target ship's size. So against corvettes and frigates, they will deal 2 times the damage you're seeing here, against destroyers 3 times that damage, against cruisers 5 times, and against battleships 9 times. Meaning the Devastator torpedoes have an average daily damage of 90 against battleships. Battleships simply cannot survive this, and even cruisers are hard pressed to stay alive. Now, I said disruptors were the best weapon. The issue that they also have is that disruptors have lower damage in terms of the static damage output, and they also cause ships to disengage more, meaning you get less kills. In order to beat your opponent, you do generally need to actually kill their ships rather than just repeatedly forcing them to disengage, and that's where torpedoes come in. A great ship design could be a cruiser with torpedoes and disruptors, or torpedoes and regular missiles. As I mentioned earlier, you could use regular missiles alongside torpedoes, allowing you to bypass some of the point defense your opponent will surely be running to prevent you annihilating their ships. These weapons also deal additional damage against star bases, against leviathans, large creatures. They are really, really, really good. They do have the drawback that you need to be in close and personal to fire these things with a range of only 30, so they're not great when you're coming up against a 25 times crisis, but against most other combat situations, yeah, they're amazing. If ancient nano-missile cloud launchers didn't require so many minor artifacts to outfit your ships with, because they are a small slot and need 10 minor artifacts apiece, they would probably be the best weapon in the game. They have a very short cooldown of 0.85 days, a massive range of 100, so you can shoot these things from relatively far away. They also, just like disruptors, fully bypass shields and armor, but unlike disruptors, they also deal an additional 25% damage against hull, which is really, really good. They have such a short cooldown that point defense is pretty much useless against them. It will reduce the damage slightly, but you will not prevent the damage coming through. If you have menacing ships and you don't have to pay the minor artifact cost, then definitely go for some of these ancient nano-missile cloud launchers. They are amazing. Last, but I think by no means least, we have something which might come as a bit of a curveball to some people watching this tier list. We have the ancient driller drones. Try saying that 10 times faster. Unlike regular strikecraft, these drones do not bypass shields. They actually have minus 50% damage against shields, which would be a problem, except for the fact that they have full penetration, 100% penetration against armor. That means that if you can find a way of stripping your opponent of their shields, i.e. fighting in a pulsar system, having the Zroni Stormcaster coming up against something that doesn't have shields, they can be absolutely amazing, as you can pair them perfectly with other bypass weaponry like disruptors, like the ancient nano-cloud missile launchers, or like the arc emitters. They're definitely not as good as some of the other weapons here in the S tier. However, I do think they are good enough to deserve their own honorable mention and place up here in the top of the tier list. They also are, coincidentally, the most powerful strikecraft in the game when you combine them with Archeo engineers, and you can increase that even further if you get your hands on the Rubricator Relic. If you've enjoyed this tier list where I've broken down all of the weapons in Stellaris, and you'd like to see me break down and analyze a different part of the game, click the video on screen now.